The church piano had a smell that Marvin could never fully describe. Varnish, maybe an old wood, and something underneath both of those things that felt like silence pressed into physical form. He had grown up sitting 3 feet from that instrument every Sunday morning, watching his father's congregation sway and clap while the designated pianist, Sister Dorothy, worked the keys with a confidence that seemed almost violent in its certainty. Marvin never touched it. He understood, without being told, that the piano belonged to the Lord in the same way the sermon did, the same way his father's voice did. It was not his to reach for, but he listened. Even when he was not supposed to be listening, when he was supposed to be reading scripture or bowing his head or keeping his eyes fixed on the floor, he was listening. He heard the way a chord could hang in the air after Sister Dorothy lifted her hands, trembling slightly before it dissolved. He heard the spaces between the notes, the small silences that made the music breathe. He carried those sounds out of the church on Sunday afternoons and held them somewhere behind his sternum for the rest of the week, waiting. By the time Marvin was 18, in the winter of 1957, he had been carrying those sounds for so long that they had become something heavier than memory. They had become a kind of pressure. He was working 3 jobs that winter: dishwasher at a diner on Pennsylvania Avenue Southeast, 2 evenings a week; loading trucks at a warehouse near the Anacostia River on Saturday mornings, cold enough that his breath came out in clouds and his fingers went numb inside his gloves. And on Sundays after church, he helped a neighbor named Mr. Elias carry furniture for people who were moving, hauling mattresses and wooden dressers up and down stairwells in the cramped row houses of Congress Heights. The pay was irregular. Sometimes $1, sometimes $2, once a $5 bill that Mr. Elias gave him, with a look that said he probably shouldn't have. Marvin kept every cent in a coffee tin under his bed, tucked against the wall where the floorboards were uneven. There were nights when he pulled the tin out and counted the money in the dark. Not because the number had changed since the last time he counted, but because the act of counting felt like proof of something. Proof that the plan was real. Proof that the thing he wanted was not simply a wish, but a direction he was actually moving in. Dollar by careful dollar, week by week. On those nights the house was quiet around him, his father asleep down the hall, his mother asleep beside his father, the street outside making its small nighttime sounds, a car passing, a dog somewhere a few blocks over, the radiator clicking and settling. He would count the bills and fold them back and put the tin away and lie in the dark for a while before sleep finally came. He did not tell his father what the money was for. He understood, without being told, that this was also not his to reach for. The store was called Sims Music, and it sat on a narrow block in Northeast Washington between a laundromat and a shop that sold religious supplies. Walter Sims had owned it for 11 years. He was a methodical man in his late 50s, heavy-set, with reading glasses that he wore pushed up on his forehead, even when he didn't need them. He sold instruments and sheet music and phonograph needles and guitar strings, and he had developed over 11 years a particular skill for reading customers the moment they walked through his door. He could tell within seconds who was browsing and who had money. He could tell who was serious and who was curious. He was rarely wrong. Marvin walked in on a Thursday afternoon in late January. He was wearing his work jacket, the one with the frayed collar, and his hands were cold from the walk. He stood in the doorway for a moment, taking in the room, the guitars on the wall, the brass instruments in the glass case near the counter, the upright piano pushed against the far wall with a handwritten price tag reading $65 taped to the side facing the door. Walter Sims looked up from the receipt he was writing and assessed the situation in approximately 3 seconds. A young black man, 18 or 19, work clothes, no visible money. He put down his pen. "Help you with something?" "I'd like to look at the piano," Marvin said. "The upright." There was a pause, not long, but not nothing. "You play piano?" "Yes, sir." Sims came around the counter slowly, the way a man moves when he is not entirely convinced the trip is necessary. The piano was a 1940s-era upright, its finish worn along the fallboard from decades of hands, its ivory keys yellowed at the edges, but intact. It was not a beautiful instrument. It was functional, solid, priced to sell. Sims had taken it on consignment from a woman in Brooklyn whose husband had died, and it had been sitting against that wall for 2 months. "It's 65, Sims said, which was not an answer to Marvin's request but was not nothing either. "I know," Marvin said. "I've been by before." Sims looked at him more carefully. "When?" "Few weeks ago, and before that." There was something in the way the young man said it that made Sims step aside from the piano bench without quite deciding to. Marvin sat down. He spread his fingers over the keys without pressing them first, just resting there, feeling the temperature of the ivory, the slight give of the keys under his palms. Then he began to play. What came out was not a recognizable song. It was not gospel exactly, though there was something in the harmony that reached back toward it. It was not the rhythm and blues records that were starting to come through on the radio, though there was something in the rhythm that brushed up against that world. It was something between those places, something that seemed to belong to a genre that did not yet have a name. The melody moved with a slowness that felt deliberate, patient, like a man choosing his words carefully because he understood the weight of each one. The woman who had been looking at sheet music near the window stopped turning pages. An older man who had been waiting for Sims to finish his receipt turned from the counter to face the piano. Sims himself stood with his arms folded and his reading glasses still pushed up on his forehead and said nothing. Marvin played for perhaps 4 minutes. When he stopped, the room held the sound for a moment, the way the church always had, that trembling after the hands lifted. Then it let go. He sat with his hands in his lap and looked at the keys. He was aware of the other people in the room in the way you become aware of things that have gone very still. He did not look at any of them. He was still inside the music, not the music he had just played, but the music that had come before it, the music that had accumulated in him over years of listening and waiting and keeping his hands to himself. "Where'd you learn that?" Sims asked. "Church," Marvin said. "And listening." Sims looked at the piano. He looked at Marvin. He pulled the reading glasses down from his forehead, which was something he rarely did when he wasn't actually reading. "You've got $65? Marvin reached into his jacket pocket and placed the coffee tin on the top of the piano. He opened it. Inside were $67 and some coins, folded bills of small denominations, the evidence of a winter's worth of diner shifts and truck loading and furniture hauling. He counted out $65 on top of the fallboard and left the rest. Sims wrote the receipt without saying anything else. When he handed it over, he held it for a second longer than necessary. "You need help getting it anywhere?" Marvin had already thought about this. He had thought about it for weeks, running through the problem the way you run through a problem that has no clean solution. He could not bring the piano home. His father's house had no room for it in any practical sense. But that was not the real reason. The real reason was harder to say out loud. A piano in that house would not belong to him. It would be absorbed into the gravity of his father's presence the way everything else was, interpreted through the lens of what was holy and what was not, judged, commented upon, possibly forbidden. He had not asked. He knew. He had arranged, 2 weeks earlier, to use the basement of a woman named Mrs. Caldwell who lived on the next block. She was 60 years old and church-going, and had known Marvin since he was a child, and when he had explained carefully that he needed a place to practice an instrument, she had looked at him for a long moment and said yes, without asking whose instrument or why he couldn't practice at home. She understood things without being told them. Some people were like that. The piano was moved the following Saturday. Sims helped him find 2 men who would do it for $3, and they carried it through the winter air to Mrs. Caldwell's basement, down narrow stairs, wedging it through a door frame that was barely wide enough. When they were done and the men had left, Marvin stood in the basement alone with the instrument and the low hum of a furnace in the corner, and a single bulb hanging from the ceiling. He did not play immediately. He sat on the bench and looked at the keys for a while. He was thinking about his father, though he would not have said so if asked. He was thinking about the church piano and the smell of varnish, and the way Sister Dorothy played with such absolute certainty, as if each note were a declaration. He was thinking about all the Sunday mornings he had sat 3 feet from that instrument and kept his hands to himself because he understood what was and was not his to reach for. He was thinking about the fact that this now was his. He put his hands on the keys. He pressed down. What he did not know sitting in Mrs. Caldwell's basement in the winter of 1957 was that he would spend the next 4 years playing in that room and in borrowed spaces, and in small clubs around Washington, and then in Chicago, and then in Detroit, building something that had no name yet in his own vocabulary. He did not know that in 1961, a man named Harvey Fuqua would bring him to a label in Detroit called Motown Records, or that the music he made there would reach people he had never met in places he had never seen. He did not know any of that yet. What he knew was the feeling of the keys under his fingers and the sound that came back to him in the low-ceiling room, and the particular quality of silence that existed in the moments between one note and the next. He had been carrying that silence for years. He was finally somewhere he could set it down. He played until the bulb above him began to flicker, until the cold had moved in through the basement windows and settled into his shoulders, until he realized he had been there for hours without noticing the time passing. When he finally stood and put on his jacket and looked at the piano one last time before turning off the light, something had shifted in a way he could not have articulated. He walked home through the dark streets of Southeast Washington, past the row houses with their lit windows, past the corner store that was already closed, past the sound of a television coming from somewhere above him on a second floor. The cold was sharp and clean. He walked with his hands in his pockets. His father was still awake when he came in, sitting in the chair by the window with his Bible open on his knee. He looked at Marvin when he entered and said nothing. Marvin said good evening and went down the hallway to his room and closed the door behind him. He lay on his back in the dark and listened to the sound of the house settling around him. The coffee tin under his bed was $2 lighter. The piano was in Mrs. Caldwell's basement, under a single flickering bulb, waiting. He had not told his father where he had been. He understood, without being told, that some things had to remain yours before they could become anything else. He was not sure yet what the piano would become. He only knew that for the first time in his life, the pressure behind his sternum had somewhere to go. That was enough for now. It would have to be.